Hey everyone. I suppose none of you would actually know because I record my videos in advance and release one at a time. But I actually haven't recorded in a few days because, well, not to try and push any agenda here, but a couple days ago, I got a burger at Red Robin, and roughly 6 hours later, I had violent, explosive issues coming from both ends that I am still dealing with. This is exactly as unpleasant as it sounds. And I actually threw out my back. That's how hard I was vomiting, and yeah, at the same time. I'm sorry for that horrible mental image. I just wanted to get across the point that I have not been doing well. Today is the first day I've been up for anything. I haven't done anything. I have been laying in bed or sitting here watching my tasks, and that's basically it because I have not had the capacity to do anything. But prior to this, we had another game session, which I wanted to talk about, and I did prep for another Voyager review. I have not even picked up Half-Life 2 yet. I apologize. I know some of you are looking forward to that. That will have to wait. I'm sorry. One other thing I wanted to address here. A lot of people like to ask me questions, and while I found that flattering, keeping up with all of them is basically impossible. This is one of the reasons I originally did the Q&A format. I have been asked directly and indirectly if I will continue with the Q&As at any point in the future. As of this moment, I find that unlikely unless circumstances change, unfortunately. It is a thing I would like to do, but I simply do not have the time, period, basically, to do so. And I can already hear some of you say, well, why don't you just drop one of these videos to do? No. um, but if I were to do that, I would do it in a more organized format. For example, I would post a thread on the forum and say, here, put your questions here, and they will be answered in this order, that kind of thing, rather than trying to compile it from 15 different sources, that kind of thing. Now, I'm going to have to check my timestamps on this one, because today we'll be talking about the episode The Cloud. Now, well, there we go. The Cloud is an episode about the crew of Voyager finding a sentient nebula, trying to explore it, finding out that it's sentient, and after failing at harvesting its delicious organs, leaving after repairing it. Pretty simple plot, all things considered, and rather tightly packed. And also a little bit on the ludicrous side, but I just thought I'd mention that to contrast two things I will be saying later on in this video. For those of you who want to skip to the actual review, I'm going to put a timestamp in the comment section. But there's something I feel I need to talk about first, and that something is Star Trek and continuity. If you feel like listening, by all means, I appreciate your patronage. Star Trek has always had, with some exceptions, a rather antagonistic viewpoint of continuity. And while I myself disagree with that, and feel that it is doing a disservice to the series and to the fans thereof, I will not ever say that it is a wrong opinion to have, because that is what it is. It is a perspective. It is not a statement of right or wrong. It is a matter of opinion. I do strongly believe that if they had tried to push more continuity, as they did later in experimental times, that the series would have done better. A series is, the franchise would have done better. But ultimately, it was not until the two given shows were in dire straits that they were willing to reach out into the realm of continuity just to try. It was basically that intent of desperation. Not, oh, well, this is something we think is a good idea, so much as, okay, well, we'll go with this because we have no other choice. And I mention that to try and get across the mentality here. I'm speaking of DS9 and, believe it or not, Enterprise, actually. Season 3 of Enterprise is one of two examples in all of the Star Trek franchise, which is true episode-to-episode continuity for a long period of time. Yes, I know the Dominion War and its 6 episodes does count as well, but that was only 6 episodes. This was an entire season of direct line continuity. And in fact, by the way, I actually rather like the Xindi arc at Enterprise. I admit this freely. The other example, in case anyone's wondering, is actually the 3 of the Star Trek movies, Star Trek 2, 3, and 4, which I only say for completion's sake, because I know someone's going to say it in the comments if I don't. Um, I'm sorry, I'm in a lot of pain right now. My back is still not doing well. I'm actually on hydrocodone to help me out, and I got a little back thing as a gift from a friend to help me work out the knots. Anyways, I'm sorry, I'm derailing. I really want to emphasize this point because I feel it's important to to get across the strength, the drama, the brevity, or the lack of brevity about this circumstance. Most people out there, who even people who are not Trekkers, or Trekkies, or Trek fans, or Trek people who are kind of acquaintances with Trek, will know what I say when I say the words best of both worlds, or, if you prefer, the Borg. There are still people out there who get chills when they think about that, myself included. The best of both worlds is the Borg in all their horror and all their glory, and it was in my opinion, one of the absolute best moments of the franchise. In that episode, even if you don't know the specifics, you do know some basics. You know that the Borg come, they assimilate, which has something to do with taking over people, which is a bit of a simplification for how absolutely atrocious and horrific assimilation really is when you think about it. And they assimilated Picard and used him against Starfleet and were inches from winning. Several of the writers, many of the writers, really pushed for a follow-up episode to that. Now, those of you out there who know that there is such an episode. It is called Family. It is a very controversial episode amongst Trek fans because some people argue that it isn't Trek at all. Some people say that the Wesley story was unnecessary, which I admittedly agree with. Some people say that they should have had more emphasis on the development of other characters in wake of the disaster, which I also agree with. But overall, I do think it is a good episode personally. I don't want to get too much into it. But the real reason that episode was a strength was it showed Picard's reaction and resultant to the severe tragedy he had been undertaken. I've talked about this before, with regards to Voyager, actually. And I was talking to this with a friend with regards to Final Fantasy VI. You do not take something, in good writing, in good presentation of media, you do not take something that is traumatizing and horrifying and terrible, mentally, physically, emotionally, or any combination thereof, and then have the characters walk it off. You don't do that. Good works, good forms of fiction, will show the impact immediately or later, or preferably both. Voyager especially kind of has a bad track record with that, but again, I don't want to get too off topic on here. What Picard went through is something so horrifying that, to be honest, it's hard to comprehend because we, as real-life humans, have nothing that equivalent. It is everything that is absolutely the worst aspects of rape and slavery and violation, mentally and physically, all at the same time, and all with a total, absolute, cold objectivity. Picard, of all characters, really needed a follow-up episode to that. And it's worth noting that there's a good reason why this character arc kept cropping up for Picard every time it was relevant. But with Family in specific, I feel like I can't overemphasize this. There was serious opposition to making Family. Serious opposition. Arguments were had, fights were made, people were debating back and forth, because no, this is Star Trek. We have an episode to episode thing, and that was the argument. No continuity, or at the very least, no relevant continuity. Next episode is the next episode. It's another week. It's another adventure. And several of the writers, again, I don't want to name any names. I don't want to see like I'm picking on anyone or exalting anyone else. But several of the writers argued strongly and on strong ground that this time, at the very least, just this one time, they needed this continuity. What happened was so devastating. And indeed, let's be honest with ourselves for a moment. Best of Both Worlds changed the franchise, both from an in-story perspective and from a writing perspective, because everything after Best of Both Worlds, it's a term that Sci-Fi Debris has coined, and I agree with it because I think it is very valid. It is a post-Wolf 359 world. Everything was different after that. So of course they should have that follow-up. And yet, even with something so powerful and so impacting to change the franchise and its direct implications with an individual character, and mind you, TNG, even here, this is season 3 and end of season 3 and beginning of season 4 here, was very well known for its characterization, its character growth. And Patrick Stewart himself was incredibly in favor of this whole thing. Sorry, I'm looking something up because I meant to before and I forgot. I cannot even fathom the idea that someone would be so violently against that level of continuity. Ah, there it is. I mention that to get across the point that Star Trek has never exactly had a great, as a franchise, never exactly had a great relationship with continuity in general. Now, there are two writers on the Voyager staff who I will not name. You could probably guess who they are based on what I'm about to say. One of them went on to work on the show 24. One of them went to work on a show called Battlestar Galactica, the reboot, obviously. Both of these writers were very strong proponents of the idea that Voyager, especially, needed to have that kind of strong continuity, that kind of episode-to-episode linking, that it needed to be one cohesive unit. They were always in favor of that, and they were always getting smacked down as a result of that, which in my opinion is probably the single strongest weakness of Voyager, because even, at least in TNG, it was mildly feasible to have no real strong continuity, because ultimately, with a few exceptions, there were no true arcs throughout TNG. Yes, you could argue that there are some, and most of them character-related, but I'm talking about, the Dominion War, the Xindi arc, those are the two most obvious ones. I'll just stop there. But how about here's another one? We're lost in the Gamma Quadrant, or I'm sorry, the Delta Quadrant, That would have been a story arc, and that was the argument they kept having, and the argument they kept getting shot down over. Because there was a disagreement about it. Now, why do I mention this here? There is another episode where this will come up even more strongly, and I'm only going to mention this in brief there. That would be the episodes The Year of Hell. I'm not going to talk about that here. Suffice it to say that that was tremendously wasted potential. But this is the first episode where the real problem actually walks into the camera view, if you understand what I mean. And I'm going to segue that directly into my next point. One of the biggest complaints about Captain Janeway is the fact that she has so many different personalities and she flops between them so often. Especially on the subject of the Prime Directive, which I'm not talking about specifically. I do mean in general. Her personality, her mindset jumped around over and over. I should go ahead and take note of the time here so I can put that in the comments. Come on, pencil. There we go. Now, the problem, and I only want to mention this briefly, but the main problem was so many of the writers wanted to portray her as the female captain. I've talked about this before. Naturally, different people have a different perspective of what the female captain means. On top of that, as usual, they had a series of rotating directors who didn't have as close a relationship with the actors as, say, the TNG cast did. And the writers, and this is very important, weren't getting together and kibitzing all that often. That's a poor example of the word, but they weren't coordinating. They weren't correlating. They would do that sometimes, and of course there was sometimes the whole written by committee problem, but overall, nobody was really on the same page. Now this is most powerfully noticed with Janeway because she's the main character of Voyager. There's no arguing that point. Nobody has as much episodes devoted to her, or anybody, as Janeway does, and she is often portrayed as the main focus of any given episode. This is a very common fact. In fact, The Cloud is another example of this. And so what we see in Janeway is the problem, one of the other problems. I know I keep saying that there's one of the problems, because there's several. But this is, again, one of those problems with Voyager as a whole. Nobody could agree on anything. And so we see about, a handful or so of different personalities for most of the cast members and most of the way that the episodes are presented, especially Janeway, because it's most obvious with her, the main character. All of this I bring up because the very beginning of this episode is something I actually kind of like, because this is a perspective of Janeway I enjoy personally. She is doing a log entry about her beliefs on how a leader should be presented towards her crew. Okay? I like that because it portrays part of the character, or at least theoretically could, if this was planned out, which obviously it wasn't, portray a part of the character that really emphasizes why it is that she's not really the commander, why she's not really the captain, why she's not truly command material. She's someone who has the capacity to command, but ultimately is not a good leader. She talks about how she prefers the cold and distant perspective, how being the larger than life, the captain, I am the captain kind of thing, and how she's trying to uphold herself to that ideal and feels like she's failing at it. If this had been refined a little bit, I think it would have been very excellently done. And I just want to mention, in this episode I'll be talking about some of my changes as I go, because this is the episode that I have the fewest changes for, and so I figure mentioning them a lot of them are tiny changes, so mentioning them as I go is a better idea. This is one of them. I have to mention that if, again, as I mentioned back in Caretaker, if Janeway was the first officer and ended up being elevated to captain when the captain died, and was basically a primarily science officer, such as Data, for example, this would have worked so much better because it fits right in with that character, someone who was basically thrust into a position she never actually wanted to be in, but feels she has to uphold. This bothers me so much. I already talked about this. This is episode 6 of Voyager, and Neelix is a bad cook. This has not come up before. Granted, the cooking thing is very recent. In fact, I believe just the last episode was the first time it was mentioned. Well, it wasn't. Okay, it was mentioned in Parallax, but you get my point. I'm sorry. I'm having trouble with thoughts. Already, we're at the point where Neelix is a bad cook, and this will be a continuing plot arc, if you could even call it that, for the first 2 seasons. I cannot even begin to emphasize how stupid of an idea this is. But I just want to go into this a little bit of detail here, because again, this is where this starts. Point one. While I could buy that Neelix is more interested in the nutritional value of food rather than the enjoyable value of food, nothing about his character, either as he's portrayed or as I prefer to envision him in my changed Neelix, says anything about that at all. Quite the contrary. Neelix, as he should be, and indeed as he is sometimes portrayed, is someone who should understand the value of good food. If nothing else, it is an incredibly powerful diplomatic tool and an incredibly useful facility to engage morale and camaraderie and general togetherness. It can help cohesion, it can help mood. I mean, I could keep going here. There are so many benefits to food being good. Everyone knows this, especially someone who has dealt with that kind of problem and is dealing with what is effectively a military vessel. And Neelix has familiarity with the military, as we find out later on, and indeed my version would have familiarity as well. The thought that he's a bad cook, I could have seen that for like an episode, maybe 2. And you know what I would have loved to see? Again, this is one of those little changes. I would have loved to someone go to Neelix and say, "Your cooking's bad," and Neelix to respond with, "I'm sorry. Because, apparently his palate is different than theirs. All the food tastes fine to him." And so it would have been a nice little mini plot arc, like a C plot. I mean, Lord knows the A plot of this episode is so frickin' ridiculous it shouldn't even be there. So why not add a C plot? Have it be something small. Have it be between what's a good? Actually, I had a perfect character in mind. I'm trying to think who it was. Uh, Come on, Taurus and Tom and Harry, and maybe even Janeway a couple times, and probably Tuvok as well. Lord knows I would love to see the Tuvok and Neelix relationship continue, and have Neelix go to them and basically try some of their foods, straight from the replicator, so to speak, or have them try things. I know you're busy, but I just need a few minutes, and I would love to see a scene where one of them argues him down, probably Janeway, about how unimportant this is, and then Neelix then gives her the speech that I just gave you about why food is important and why good food is very important. And so she says, "Okay, we'll try it, but even amongst the same species, tastes are going to differ." And he says, "I know, but I'd like to at least make some of my food good, or try to do different dishes for different folks, something like that." Have Neelix spend the next couple of episodes becoming a better cook for the crew. Don't say he was actually a bad cook to begin with. Just say he's a sufficient. In fact, quite the contrary. The mere fact that he has the flexibility to change his style and change his ingredients and change his methods to make food that people like that he's never met before until a few weeks prior, basically, shows how good of a cook he is. If you understand my meaning here, or at least it would show that. And that's how I would change that whole thing. Now, I do love this episode for a lot of little things. One of them is the background events. They do this several times in the episode. The director has something amusing or entertaining going on in the background, while something a lot less amusing and entertaining is usually going on in the foreground. The first example of this is Janeway is running around looking for coffee and failing miserably as a rather boring conversation is going on. And I love that. I love those little touches. You know me, I like little things like that. But I do have to mention, and this is extremely important for the overall structure of my change to this episode, the conversation between Tom and Harry about why you shouldn't invite a captain to the chair, why there's certain protocols and stuff, should have been flipped. I wouldn't have even changed the dialogue. Have Harry, the kid straight out of the academy, the guy who is literally could probably quote several regulations off the top of his head still, be the one who says, you don't just invite a captain to the chair. It's improper. There's social polities. If the captain wants to sit here, the captain will ask us if they can join. We don't ask them. And have Tom be the one to contradict that and say, well, I don't agree. I think things would be different. A, it would be a lot more in character. B, well, I'll get to B later. Um, oh God. I I actually forgot that I hadn't said this speech yet because I've been sick and I've been having some fever issues, so not a lot of sleep. Um, I don't want to get too far into this. I really don't. But I want to get this out of the way right now because I don't want to talk about this every time it comes up throughout the rest of the series. There are two reasons why I think the American Indian thing that they did with Chakotay was incredibly poorly executed and frankly stupid. Technically, three reasons. The first reason, the minor reason, the third reason, I'll go over very quickly. Back in the day, certain companies, Walmart's a big example here, would hire someone who was disabled or crippled, or if we want to go further back in time, we could go to the time when civil rights movements were still in their infancy and still having trouble. Someone would hire someone of a different skin or a different gender, basically as a token blank person, whatever it is, take token disabled, token female, whatever, specifically for the point of being able to say, look how progressive we are. There was no effort made. Well, okay, I'm speaking in generalizations. There were plenty of companies that hired these people because there was no reason not to. Don't mistake me. But several corporations, especially larger corporations, would do so as a matter of policy, specifically so they had that shield against anyone who would accuse them of being prejudiced. You understand what I mean? And this was a fairly common practice for a while. So that's what Chakotay feels like so much. And let me just emphasize why this is such an insulting thing to me personally. It's like if I were to pull someone off the street and say, hey, I'd like to hire you. And that person's like, oh, really? Awesome. And I was like, yeah, you fit the perfect demographic so that I can show people how progressive I am. And the guy's like, well, don't you want to know about my qualities, what I can do? I was like, nah, it doesn't matter. I can't even fire you if I tried. Nor am I going to ever attempt to. You've got your paycheck for the rest of your life, and I'm going to give you the most humdrum activity possible to make sure that you don't actually interfere with my business, because, hey, I don't think you can actually do any work. Come on. And the guy at this point's like, what, I don't think this is a very good idea. I was like, oh, no, don't worry. You just get a paycheck, and you just stand around, and everyone can just look at the freak, basically. It's insulting. It's insulting to the person, it's insulting to the company, to be a little bit blunt, and it's insulting to the concept of equality in general. And that's the reason number one why I think the whole Chakotay thing was so poorly handled, because so many times it comes across as, you know, every Star Trek has had someone who is, I can't even believe I'm saying this because the thought is so ludicrous to me, but has also had someone controversial on the crew, having Uhura back in the old series, or Chekhov or Sulu, for example, was considered controversial. I seriously can't even believe that, but, different time. Um, having in TNG we had an alien, a Klingon actually, which was a specific choice made on the show. Now, granted, that is a fictional thing, but it was still done for the same reason. Now, thank God they actually went somewhere with Worf, and they did go somewhere with Uhura and thing. Don't mistake me. I'm not saying that these were the token people. I'm saying that Star Trek has always had someone who was controversial. In Deep Space Nine, we had Benjamin Sisko as the commander and later the captain. Yeah, awesome. But in Voyager, rather than actually picking someone and going with it as a character, as all these other examples have, they picked someone and did the Walmart example that I just mentioned. I'm sorry, I don't mean to call out Walmart. I know several Walmarts that do good work, and I don't want to be ill-intended towards them. But they did that insulting thing to Chakotay. Hey, look how progressive we are. We're not prejudiced. We don't have any problems. Look! Second problem. I don't want to go into too much detail. I know I've already said that. If you were to replace Chakotay with someone who was a Catholic, okay, and say that this Catholic had beliefs from Buddhism, Muslim, Hindu, uh, Protestant church, I mean, Church of England, you name it. I'm sorry, I'm having trouble coming up with examples. I had a whole list. But, just down the list, right? Just one aspect, one belief of each of these things kind of crammed together. And and then he's Catholic, and that's their portrayal of him as this guy. And I'll get to that more in a bit. But every time you see him, he's talking about this belief or that belief, even though, again, anybody who knew anything about any of these things would recognize, A, they're not Catholic, and B, they'd probably be able to recognize their source of origin. The reason they got away with it is because very few people know Indian or Native American or whatever you want to call them's various belief systems. Indeed, they actually pick and choose from multiple continents when it comes to Chakotay's beliefs. Now, I have to admit personally that if they'd made up a tribe and made up beliefs specifically for that tribe, I might be willing to go with it, but that's not what they did. They took this grab bag of things because, hey, it all sounds Indian-y to us. You know, what do you think when you see a dream catcher or bow and arrow or all that? It was just so blatantly prejudiced. I shouldn't say prejudice. It was profiling, is really what it is. Because I don't think there's any genuine and malicious intent upon the writers, especially given what they went through writing Chakotay. I'm not going to detail that story, by the way. That's a moderately well-known story about the problems that went into the research into American Indians for Chakotay, and there were problems. Let's be honest. But I don't. But this is what I like to call the racism from ignorance. Okay. There's racism from genuine ill intent, which is I actually don't know any personal examples. I suppose I'll go to the obvious example, Hitler. I'm sorry, that's probably not even actually correct, but let's just use Hitler here because Hitler had just this big old thing against all sorts of groups of people, well, including the Jews, for example. That is genuine malicious intent, and not hiding it and not pretending, just screw you and giving them the finger constantly, right? Obviously, that's, in my opinion, one of the most reprehensible forms of racism, or sexism, or anythingism. The second layer after that is someone who has that same mentality. I hate these people, I hate these groups, I hate these genders, but hides it because they feel it is socially unacceptable to admit that. While there are some obvious problems with that mentality, I will at least give that thing more credit than the first category for at least trying to rein in their problems. Not something I approve of, but at the very least it's not as bad as Category 1, right? Category 3 is what you see more often in fiction, or rather I should say in the creation of fiction, which is racism from ignorance, like I just mentioned. This is someone who either doesn't realize that they're being racist, or is so casual about it that it doesn't even occur to them to think that there's anything wrong with it, if you understand my meaning. A good example of this would be the episode Code of Honor back in TNG, which is blatantly, horrifically racist, and yet everything, now granted, this is all second, third, or fourth person information here, but everything I've read and studied about that episode indicates that none of that racism was deliberately intentional, if you know what I mean. It was never malicious. It was just racism from ignorance. Still a problem, let's be honest with ourselves. Still something that needs to be addressed. But this is the category that Chakotay falls in so often. It especially doesn't help that most of these writers knew nothing about American Indians other than their faulty research, and if you could even call what they did research. And so it's not only insulting to American Indians, it's insulting to anybody who knows anything about them, and frankly, if I can be completely honest with myself, it's insulting to humanity in general. I admittedly am a very tolerant, equality kind of guy. I've talked about this before. The idea of being united without being uniform is something I have championed for a long time. Being together because of our differences, not in spite of them. That kind of thing, right? I've talked about this before. It is, in my opinion, selling people short to have that kind of, oh, well, he's an Indian, or oh, he's a black guy, or whatever, or he's a female. Wait. You get my point. That sort of thing bothers me. It genuinely does. And it sells short the viewers, it sells short the actors and actresses, and frankly, it sells short the franchise as a whole. I will say no more on this matter other than my last point, but it is my opinion that the whole Chakotay arc, if you could call it that, was a complete mistake for this reason alone. Now, ironically, I'm now going to drive the last nail in the coffin here, because even if you ignore any racism, intended or otherwise, any profiling, intended or otherwise, any difficulties with it, intended or otherwise, even ignoring all of that, if it was all ejected, if it had all been perfectly, if they had researched it properly, if they had done all that properly, there is a very strong problem with the Chakotay I'm an Indian thing. And that is so many of the Chakotay episodes. And this is why I want to get this out of the way right now, because this is where this starts. But so many of the Chakotay episodes, I don't want to keep reiterating this point. We don't learn about Chakotay. We don't learn a damn thing about Chakotay. His character barely moves because everything we learn is about his beliefs, about his people, about his people's history, about his people's past. While these things can be used by a good writer to emphasize a character, that is not what has been done here. This has been done in place of characterization. And I've talked before, there's three things that characterization includes, right? Past, their current, the character's history, their current characterization, and their character growth. All of these have been ejected completely in favor of, here's what my people think. And again, that is not only selling a short, but that is a graven mistake from a literary perspective, from a fictional perspective, from a marketing perspective, and from a basic human perspective. Because, damn it, Chakotay had so much potential, and we could have had a genuinely interesting good character. I have faith in Robert Beltran. Had faith in Robert Beltran. The man could have done something with that role. And there are a few scarce moments where we get to see him do something awesome in this show. And I will definitely be pointing those out. But the other 90% of the time, all we learn is about his people. And this episode is no exception. One of the first things we do have is a conversation between Chakotay and Janeway about Chakotay's people. We don't learn a damn thing about him. Not one. Moving on. There was one thing I actually really liked and then immediately didn't like. There's a scene where Kim says, oh, I've never seen anything like this on the bridge, honestly showing a good deal of his character there. I actually rather liked that. It was very in keeping, especially when Tuvok called him on it and said, it is not appropriate for a bridge officer in order to exclaim something like that. It makes the junior officers nervous, right? I actually kind of like that because there is. Let's keep in mind this is a Navy ship, basically a military ship. There should be a degree of decorum, especially on the bridge, especially with a crew that is under extreme circumstances like this. And so while Tuvok was probably coming off a little harshly. I liked the reveal of the showing of Harry being, oh, this is amazing, and Tuvok politely reminding him, hey, keep it down, keep it to yourself because you don't want to worry the others. Just a few minutes later, Neelix then immediately does a rejoinder, which is the most petty and childish thing in the damn world, and I do not like that. There's no saving that. Now, there was a scene where Neelix was talking about how much he's pissed off at Janeway for constantly going into dangerous circumstances and whatnot. I feel like that scene should have been better. I feel like it started somewhere else and then got molded into a let's make Neelix an idiot in order for comedy thing again, okay? Again, changes I would make. The original intent of that scene is how I would make it full flesh. That is to say, Neelix is a survivor, not an explorer. And there is a viable difference between these two. Let's be honest with ourselves. Someone who is used to living with what he has and dealing with what he has and being crapped on constantly by the universe is not likely to be an explorer, someone who wants to peer into every little crack, but someone who is used to surviving. And from his perspective, what they are doing is foolish, wasteful, and downright stupid. He could have portrayed that perspective so much better in a way that wouldn't have made him look like a moron, and an unpleasant thing. I don't want to say anything here, but you get the point. In contrast to that, I wouldn't have changed Kes at all because she is very much an explorer. That's been a part of her character ever since the first episode. So having Kes be like, I would open every single tiny crack in the universe. The line "I've never kissed someone in a nebula before" is a little cheesy, but I actually rather like that because we as human beings tend to affix import and impact upon things that don't actually have any direct literal or physical importance or impact, because that's our nature. And so the idea of someone never having kissed someone in a nebula before, for example, actually rather appeals to me. And the fact that that would mean something to her and that she would share that with him, I like that a lot. And so if you toned him down and gotten his perspective out better and then contrasted that with her perspective, I think that scene could have worked really well. Now, there's one other thing I want to mention. I tend to be very organized. Anybody who's been watching my D&D blogs know this. I keep track of things very well. I often do things down to the hour just to make sure things work out, that kind of thing, right? One of the things I would have done in this show is I would have had a running tally of how many torpedoes they'd used or replenished, what their energy reserves were at, how many shuttles they'd used, what the status of their general status of certain important systems, such as the replicators, the holodeck, that kind of thing. I would have kept all of this in mind, and I would have kept a running tally of it, episode to episode, and to help that whole continuity thing, right? I mention this because in this episode they do one thing very right. As they're trying to escape the cloud, Chakotay mentions we have a complement of however many torpedoes, 30-something torpedoes. Janeway immediately rejects the idea almost as a knee-jerk reaction because we only have 30-something torpedoes. And I liked that. The fact that they eventually resorted to it as a last-ditch measure was fine, and I would have checked one off on the list. Of course, Voyager wouldn't keep that thing true. There are some sites out there that have actually kept track and counted how many shuttles they've blown up, what just the various inconsistencies and how ridiculous it actually gets. But nevertheless, acknowledging it here, keeping the rest of the series ignored, was a good move, and I actually rather like that. The French pool hall I'm going to talk about later, because that gets really strong into my changes thing. The holodeck problem in general I'm also going to talk about later. And, well, I do want to mention one thing with regard to that scene. Again, this is going into that overarching my theme for this episode and my changes. There's one scene I would not change at all, not even a line, nor its presentation. After the end of the pool hall scene, Tom is setting up the pool table, and Harry goes to play it, and Harry says something so casually. He says, "You miss it too, don't you? You try to hide it." And Tom says, "What?" And Harry just kind of says, "Home." And Tom looks at him with this horrible look, and then he says, I forget what he says, but play the game, basically. He doesn't actually answer him. I liked that, and that would be something I would definitely keep because it keeps in my overall theme for this episode. I love the scene of the Doctor. I really did. I have to also mention that the directing in that... I've mentioned the good directing in this episode in general. It was nice to see the bridge from a different perspective, to see things slightly differently like that, and actually to have the actors in the background who, let's be honest, were probably kind of bored since they're basically just doing this until their cue comes up. Nevertheless, actually having them there was a nice additional step to flesh out the scene. Very, very well done, I thought. And having Ricardo in the background, just kind of pacing back and forth on the screen as they're doing their thing, and then he finally gets up and he's like, because they've turned off his audio, and he's like, "Come on." That was an awesome scene. Very well done. Definite props there to the director and to Ricardo for that. I'm just going to quote myself here. Neelix Scene, there's a scene where Neelix gets even more enraged, and again, I would have ejected the scene entirely, by the way. But he gets so enraged that they're going to go back into the thing, and he goes up to the captain and is like, "I'm getting out, and we're leaving, and we'll get back on the ship when you're back, because I don't want to take people into danger, blah, blah, blah." What I wrote was, Neelix Scene equals stupid to the point of unpleasant, but it was nice to see Mulgrew actually acting as a captain. That's all I'm going to say about that scene. Now, there was one other thing that I liked. Later on, after the free fall incident, Neelix comes up to the bridge with some treats. Now, I actually really liked the very beginning of that scene. I shouldn't even say the very beginning. All of it except for like the last two lines, okay? Neelix comes up there. Now, in my version of the show, I would have had him have a genuine disagreement with Janeway. Not the kind of thing that he just did, but an honest argument with her about the situation. And again, those differing perspectives, because Janeway is also an explorer. And I would have, well, obviously she had a lot on her mind and different things going on. I would have had her explain her perspective to Neelix and blah, blah, blah. Now, obviously, in my true version of the show, this scene wouldn't have happened. And I almost regret that because I don't know how I could work it in, but let's just move on. Neelix comes onto the bridge, offers treats to them, and says, "Well, I could come up here and say I told you so, or I could come out and try to help out in my own humble manner." And this is the first time the words morale officer comes up. On paper, that was a great idea. And I actually really like that. And I like the idea of Neelix trying to help out. Something about that just appeals to me. I know everything I just said about, the bridge and certain decorum kind of contrast that, but at the same time, The kind of leader I tend to be, and the kind of environment I tend to lead within, would be the kind of thing where if we had just been through a traumatic circumstance and we were slowly working our way out and there was no immediate danger, if someone came up with some treats to try and cheer everyone up as a way to help, I would have given them heartfelt thank yous for their kind thoughts and their attempts in adding to the situation in their, as Neelix himself said, own humble way. I really liked that. And then he immediately ruined it by trying to lead them into a thing of song. They do that a lot. Neelix, I've mentioned this before, Neelix tends to have scenes that are like, great, 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 no. I don't get that. And it'll only get worse as time goes on, but let's move on. Okay, I come from a medical background, okay? I have nurses and the best pharmacist I've ever known in my family, you know. I know a decent about medicine and always have, because duh. The fact that they called... This is a problem Voyager has, too. They have a tendency to call anything that isn't from the current era ancient. And this... someone also went back and figured out what was considered ancient. And it was a whole period of like 3,000 years total of history. It's something absolutely ridiculous. Including fictional history, I might add. But one of the things they label in this episode as ancient is sutures. Now... I don't want to say anything because I have no idea of the truth on this matter, but to me, the thought of sutures being ancient is ludicrous. However, I also have to remind myself that in Season 2 of TNG, Pulaski had to explain what a splint was to a trained medical professional. Moving on. Let's see, what do we got here? Is that it? I do believe that's it. So let's get into my changes. Now, I've alluded to this whole time. This theme, this arc, this what I would do with this. This whole episode would be about two characters primarily, with Harry as a secondary character. Tom and Janeway. Yes, I know they get a lot of attention, but I think this episode really highlights why those two characters would work well in this fashion, okay? I mentioned earlier that the conversation between Harry and Tom would be reversed, right? I also mentioned the holodeck problem, okay? Let's discuss the holodeck problem first. Part of me understands why they want to do the whole period pieces thing as writers, but the reason I'm actually in favor of the holodeck is because it is from an in-lore perspective, from a believability perspective, or from a personal perspective, if you prefer. Because one of the things I have always been a large advocate of in real life is that life needs to be enjoyable. Not all the time, of course. I'm not a hedonist. But if you don't enjoy life, if you are not, in other words, to put it frankly, living, then what's the point? Now, of course, there are certain exceptions to this. For example, there have been no less than 3 periods of my life where I was not living. I was not even existing. I was surviving. I was able to put up with those and keep going through those horrible times because I knew they would end. Let's take a look at Voyager and assume the holodeck was never going to be used because it was too much of an energy drain, okay? What we have then is a situation where all you have is basically the equivalent of your job and a book, or whatever you could get on those pads. And that's it. Forever. That is your life now. There is no reprieve. There is no break from that. The level of dread and despair and hopelessness that would engender within more than a few people, myself included, is catastrophic. I argue that the holodeck should have been used because, let us be honest, its primary use within the Star Trek universe is for the entertainment of its crew, to help them enjoy life. Why not, rather than make the holodeck work all the time and throw in this completely ludicrous and pointless and stupid and irrelevant and dumb and excuse that the holodeck is incompatible with the rest of their power systems, why not ration it? They already ration replicator usage. Why would it not make perfect sense to ration out holodeck usage? Now, obviously, it would be rationed out a little bit further. You know, the impression is always given, and the way I would have done it personally is replicator rations are on a daily basis, whereas, say, holodeck rations are on a weekly basis because of how many the crew are, and everybody on the crew has to get a turn, right? And it takes more energy than just replicating something. So, you get the point here. Each person gets an hour or 2 a day, and that's about it. Now, that obviously, that isn't going to be completely fair, and I'd have to actually work out the details, but you get the point, right? Ration it out. Because someone on the ship would realize, if nothing else, the doctor would realize the necessity for having something like that. From a medical perspective, if absolutely nothing else. And I think certain other people would argue for it, Tom included, for a quality of living perspective. So I'll keep the holodeck. Just ration it out. Don't use it as though it's just, hey, free stuff. No, no, no. Now, there are some obvious problems with that, and I don't want to go into them, to be honest with you. I really don't. But let's just move on, okay? So, Tom goes into the holodeck, and what does he create? He creates the one place he has ever thought of as home. This French pool hall where he spent so many of his years back at the academy and back when he was on Earth, spending his time there learning the game, hanging out with his friends. He programs in several of his friends that he's known, and I would have expanded the friends list rather than the extremely one-dimensional characters we get. I would have people he knew throughout his life. Even if they're only one-shots in this one thing, I would have still had them there, because in total contrast to the Chakotay thing, I would be showing, or I would be trying to show, Tom's past in an effort to show Tom, in an effort to show the audience what kind of person Tom is, and where he came from, and why he is the way he is, that kind of thing, right? So expand upon that theme, have him really talk about things. There's one other point I wanted to mention. I'm sorry, this is a very minor thing. There is a single line in the episode where he talks about how his pocket was picked, and Harry says, "Really?" And Tom says, "Yeah, they only do it to tourists. They give it back." And then he adds most of the time. I would have ejected that most of the time for two very big reasons. One, I think the line works better without it. Two, while I have never been a big fan of the Star Trek utopian Gene Roddenberry ideal thing, one of the things that has been true throughout the series is that Earth, not the Federation, not Starfleet, and not Star Trek as a whole, but Earth is a paradise. Sisko himself said it best over in Deep Space Nine. There is no war, there is no crime, there is no hunger, there is no disease. They have conquered it all. That planet is as close to paradise as it is basically possible to reach. I'm okay with that idea, especially given the fact that it is very widely accepted that humans didn't accomplish that. But people did, if you understand what I mean. Humans and aliens, Vulcans and Andorians and all sorts, all combined forces to make this planet this wonderful place. And I love that line because it's such a quiet, subtle little reminder of the fact that even that Earth is that paradise. And, of course they pick your pocket. They do it because it's the same reason they would do anything to tourists like that. If you were at Disneyland, for example, they'd try to walk up and hug you in the Mickey Mouse outfit. Why? Because you're a tourist. You're there to enjoy yourself, and even if you don't want it necessarily, you can always just kind of wave them off or whatever. But they're always going to give it back. It's always in good fun, that kind of thing, right? I liked that line, but I'm sorry, I'm derailing it a little bit. I would have had that whole scene continue, and the ending lines, like I already mentioned, would be the exact way it is, where Harry hits the nail right on the head. You miss it too, don't you? You try to hide it, but you miss it too. You miss home. And Tom has no response to that. Later on, I would change a single facet of the episode. Okay, there is an argument scene. I didn't actually mention this scene because I wanted to talk about this here. Between Janeway and Chakotay. Wait. No, there isn't. Oh, God, I'm sorry. This is something I would add. Is an argument scene between Janeway and Chakotay, okay? They find out this cloud is sentient. They find out they've injured it. They also know that they have lost 11% of their power. Now, I'm sorry, I don't mean to beat this point on the ground, but losing 11% of your power reserves in a single incident is gargantuan, okay? That cannot be overemphasized. So Janeway, without even thinking about it, immediately starts asking, how can we look about repairing this thing? And at that way, Chakotay kind of looks at her for a second and says, "Can I speak with you in private?" And then Chakotay would have dragged her off into her ready room, and I would have had the two had a genuine argument about this issue. And one of the things I like about this idea, I'm sorry, God, I must have been really out of it, because I actually dreamed this scene or something, and I thought it was actually in the episode, is Chakotay would be arguing that they don't have the materials to do this. They don't have the resources, they don't have the energy. This is risky, we're risking the ship. This is a bad idea. He is arguing he is portraying the argument that we need to think about survival. We need to think about ourselves. Janeway, of course, is thinking about the Starfleet ideal, something that the science officer and the person who was never actually led would cling to. We need to do the right thing. It doesn't matter what it costs us. We need to go and make things right. We caused that creature damage. Now, the reason I like the way that would be presented, especially because I know Mulgrew and Beltran could both pull this off, is Chakotay is in fact in favor of the latter. Chakotay wants to do the right thing. He is an extremely moral individual at his core. He quit Starfleet on strong moral grounds. He is someone who wants to say, to hell with the rules, to hell with our limitations, let's go save that creature. But his training and his experience and his, well, not even his training, his experience, his cynicism, brings him down to the point where he argues the opposite of his own viewpoint, while Janeway, ironically, is the exact opposite. Someone who is the science officer, someone who uses her brain, someone who sees the situation and knows intellectually we shouldn't do this, and yet is arguing it because she believes she should. And I would love to see that debate go back and forth between the two until it reaches the point where the two look at each other and realize the full brevity of the situation. I keep using that word. The full weight of the situation. Because brevity actually means the opposite of that. I don't know why I'm doing that. And finally agree on a degree of compromise. Now this is where this whole thing comes full circle. They send out a shuttle. In this shuttle they need two people. They need their best pilot because they've already detected these eddies and as ways to flow throughout the creature without too much resistance, and so a shuttle will suffice. Yes, there's some niggling details that would have to be worked out for a shuttle to work in this circumstance. I'm not worried about that. I'm not going into the nitty-gritty details. And they would have someone who is an expert in science on hand in order to actually perform the surgery, the sutures, the ancient sutures on the creature. That would be Harry Kim. And on this trip, they could have their own little drama, and it doesn't actually matter, to be honest, because the whole point of this, from a literary perspective, from my perspective as the writer, is the two would have a brief conversation where it would either be stated outright or implied. I'm not sure. I'd have to really work out the details of the lines and the specific directing of the scene. That Tom... I had a line that I actually wanted Tom to say, which is basically, nobody's ever cared about me but you. And the way I wanted to lead into this was Harry talking about home again, and talking about Livy, his fiancée, talking about his parents, talking about his friends, talking about his teachers and his career and all these things. And then Tom just stays silent for a while as Harry is, talking about all this thing. And Harry turns to him and says, "So who do you have back home?" And Tom just kind of laughs at himself and says, "Harry, the only person who's given a damn about me in years is sitting right next to me." And I like that for a lot of reasons, especially because it is so infitting with the two of their characters. Harry is someone who, fresh out of the academy, nevertheless immediately accepted Tom without question or hesitation, even though everyone else on Voyager was shunning him, or outright ignoring him, or having genuine bile and hatred towards him. Harry was the one who reached out to him. And again, like Tom said, was the only person in the last several years who actually demonstrated a degree of caring about Tom Paris. Tom, of course, being an extremely moral individual, as I've said before, someone who cares and to hell with the rules, is someone who, without question or hesitation, took Harry under his wing, even knowing with the cynicism and bitterness that has built around him over these years, that Harry was just as likely to shun him off just like all the others did. He still immediately was there for him, more than once. This shows the strength of that relationship and the way it has grown. I'd like to take an aside to say that while I have nothing against gay people, I do not see anything gay about their relationship. I know that's been batted around before. I don't see it, and I don't agree. Moving on. That is, of course, I've already basically emphasized the main arc of this, but it really comes full circle right at the end. Tom... And the procedure is a success. Tom and Janeway are in a turbolift heading somewhere, and Tom gets out and he pauses. And he turns to Janeway. And he does what Harry did to him. Because he sees Janeway, and he knows, he is experienced and wise enough to recognize that Janeway has been alienating herself from the crew on purpose. And knowing exactly what that kind of loneliness is like, he offers his hand in friendship to her. Just like Harry gave a hand of friendship to him. And thus we see the first steps towards this crew becoming, forgive me, a family. Something more than just comrades, something more than just co-workers, something more than just people who work together and happen to be on the same ship, the same crew. Really making those first steps, actually moving towards one another. And then, Janeway goes to the pool hall and awesome stuff happens. That's how I would have done it. Now, I kind of skipped over one section because I wanted to get to that. Oh, God, I've talked forever. I'm sorry. Did I like the episode back then? I don't even remember. I remember at the time thinking that the plot was ridiculous and what the heck's going on with the holodeck. Do I enjoy the episode now? Genuinely, yes. I mean that sincerely. This is one of the first episodes in Voyager I've actually enjoyed rewatching. Take that for whatever it's worth. For now, I'm gonna go collapse. So I'll see you guys later.